Now, seeing an article online about a new Modern Warfare title in the works got my attention. The teaser trailer with the night vision clips and the high-detail character models held my attention, and the nostalgia caused me to shell out my hard-earned dollars for this game. The Call of Duty series really needs no introduction to most people. Everyone sort of knows what this game is if you've been alive for more than a few years. It's a pop culture icon, it prints money virtually each and every time a sequel gets released, hence why Infinity Ward had to create multiple third-party development companies to farm these games out every year, to keep them coming on a yearly basis for better or for worse. Before I start, it's worth mentioning that for the purposes of this review, I'll be reviewing the game as it was upon launch. I'm aware that Infinity Ward have already started to implement some new content, though they are refusing to listen to players asking for simple things like changes such as map voting or making some adjustments to the maps to address issues like widespread camping and multiplayer. All of that aside, how did this game turn out? I'm Unreal, and I'll give you a review from an average gamer. Well, this game and I did not start off on the right foot, and it began even before I was able to actually launch the game. First of all, it wasn't the easiest purchase that I've ever made, not even compared to some of its predecessors. It was not available on Steam. I couldn't easily find a physical copy of the game for PC, though that's true for most games nowadays. So I was forced to buy it using one of three currently obscure digital means. Number one, the Epic Game Store. It's a relatively new rival to Steam, and it's got some popularity, but not the widespread amount of available titles and functionality that Steam does thus far. Number two, the Battle.net store. Or number three, the Games Planet store. Now, all three of these mediums require the creation of more accounts. More accounts. More accounts. Enough with the extra accounts! I'm sick of it! Anyway, I chose Games Planet as it was slightly less expensive. And on the note of expensive, like many AAA titles these days, they just can't simply give you the game and have everything come with it. Oh no. You see, you now have to buy season passes and battle chests and DLCs and all of that various crap so the game developers can get the most money from you and hold your attention using release dates instead of good addictive gameplay like they used to 10 to 15 years ago. So getting a version of the game with all the little extras you can get is going to set you back somewhere between $80 to $100 with taxes included. Or you can buy the standard edition for $60, which even at that price point I'm always going to be hard-pressed to say is good value, since, like the Battlefield games, every Call of Duty release is basically the same game every year with new character models and new maps. Once I created a Games Planet account and purchased the game, I then had to download and install the Battle.net client, because once again, every big company has to have their own program. They can't just make it easy for the user by using Steam or a normal EXE launcher like the good old days. Nope, you have to load up yet another program every time, which takes up more RAM and CPU power that could probably be better spent elsewhere, because Activision Blizzard must have full control. And for those of you who think I'm singling out Activision Blizzard for this, I'm not. I'm well aware that EA Games has been doing this for years with Origin, and that Rockstar Games just installed their own client on people's PCs, whether you liked it or not, by the way. And I'll get to that on my Red Dead Redemption 2 review, and my overview of GTA Online in 2019. Once the Battle.net client was installed, I was then able to download the game, or so I thought. Instead of the usual 1 or 2 hour download time it takes for most games on Steam, this took nearly 5 hours. 5 hours for a linear first-person shooter with no explorable world, with moderate-sized maps, and no built-in DLC. It was painfully slow to download, but finally, after nearly 5 hours, it was over. Until it started downloading more stuff. Yep, the initial install size wasn't enough. Now I had to download a big, hefty release patch, which to me looks like a red flag, not to mention the fact that Activision Blizzard tries to hammer into your head that you need to update your graphics drivers before you play the game. It's right there staring you in the face when you launch the game, and yes, having up-to-date graphics drivers is a good idea, but when a company is desperate enough to put it in big letters on the front of their launcher every time you start it up, that says to me that the game is going to perform like crap if you don't do their driver update. So that leads me to believe that even though they developed and presumably test the game on older driver versions, they had to go out of their way to work with AMD and NVIDIA to get the game to work the way that it should using new drivers. But now with the big fat patch out of the way and the graphics driver update, I finally had done enough downloading prior to launching the game that I figured, and I could now launch the game and start playing. Nope, Chuck Testa. Once the game launched, it had even more downloading to do. including shaders upon shaders upon shaders. I had to pause said shader download so I could actually play the game because I simply got sick of waiting. After a couple of days of intermittent playing, I finally logged into the game on a day off and let it sit at the main menu to finish its updates in its entirety. Why couldn't they give me said updates without having them stress my CPU and graphics card by running the game is beyond me. Maybe someone from Infinity Ward can explain it down in the comments. But finally, with the shaders paused, I was able to go through some of the campaign and tell everyone about my gameplay experience. And here was my gameplay experience. The first cutscene loads. Our war is not for our faith. Upon the villain in the first cutscene saying the word not, the game immediately crashed to desktop. Great, let's try this again. Over and over, the cutscenes would encounter horrible lag, like I was trying to use the software rendering option on a video game back in the 1990s. Boy, that really dates me. With each stutter, it felt like the game was taunting me, threatening to crash to the desktop and forcing me to start all over again and again and again. It's a shame, really, because the cutscenes are wonderfully animated and the voicing is actually pretty good. After wiping the nerve sweat away from my brow, I get dropped into a dark wooded area to begin my nighttime Spec Ops experience, reminiscent of the gameplay trailer. Now, the ambient effects looked great. The fog and the foliage looked very realistic and created a great atmosphere, coupled with some above-average character models for the series. I almost said to myself, this doesn't even look like a Call of Duty game, until I moved to the right and came upon some low-quality rocks, which looked like they came from Call of Duty 2. So we're back to the same old graphic standards, save for the better character models and ambient effects. And before you ask, yes, I had the details turned all the way up. Unlike the debacle of a PC release Call of Duty Black Ops was, the game actually does run really well with everything turned up without having to do any sort of modifications or wait for days or weeks for a patch to fix the frame rate issues. Using an Intel 9900K, 32GB of RAM, and a GeForce 1070 with a mild overclock, I was able to stay somewhere between the mid-60s to mid-80s for frame rate even while recording video of everything I was doing. Without trying to reveal too much about the story, much like previous Call of Duty entries, the story is split up among several different main characters which you take control of at various different points in the game, and you will see a resurgence of a couple of familiar characters, including, most notably, Captain Price, who has been a recurring character through most of the Call of Duty games ever since the first one back in 2003. Now, the story follows what should be a compelling tale about chemical weapons falling to the hands of the wrong people, predominantly some Middle Eastern terrorists and a rogue Russian general, thereby putting the entire world in danger. But during the entire campaign, I couldn't help but think how similar the story was to Call of Duty Black Ops and the Nova 6 chemical weapon falling into the hands of Soviet Russia. Now, the story is well written enough, the voice acting and motion capture is great, but it's all somewhat predictable if you've played a few or all of these games or watched a half dozen war movies in your lifetime. Now, the game follows the same basic formula except for a couple of notable changes. It's a 5 to 7 hour single-player campaign spread out across various locations in the Middle East and Europe, and a multiplayer mode on small to moderate-sized maps. The key differences this time, however, number one, Infinity Ward finally stole a page out of Battlefield's book and added in huge maps and vehicles for larger-scale warfare, and number two, they've added a co-op mode to the game. Now, I was hoping that this would be similar to the last couple of Ghost Recon games, where you could have a squad of people go in, play the entire single-player story together, which would make sense since these games traditionally have multiple playable characters in them, and could fit right in. But instead, it seems to be somewhat of a continuation, quote-unquote, of the single-player story, but without any cutscenes. They're basically multiplayer maps with objectives on them where you have to fight through unending waves of enemies until you do what the game tells you to do. Kind of reminds me of the Rush mode from Battlefield, except it's against AI combatants. Sadly, like a vast number of previous Call of Duty games, items for use in the game are locked behind a progression system. This has always bothered me in shooter games, since usually the progression system has nothing to do with how good of a player you are, nor does it protect you from going into high-level areas when you're a low-level like it would in some RPG games. Instead, it's a fabricated way of keeping you playing. Now, while I understand that modern shooter games aren't simulators, they're supposed to incorporate somewhat of an authentic military combat experience, and as I'm sure some military members can confirm for you, you don't get sent overseas with nothing but a BB gun and a water pistol until you earn 100 confirmed kills before you're handed anything better. You're given the equipment you need to do your job from the get-go. The grind is completely useless. It forces people to keep playing for that next weapon or for that next attachment or that next skin. When the first few Call of Duty games were out, I used to play them all the time because the gameplay was fun and addicting and I could hop in and out of them at any moment. Now that first-person shooter games have incorporated so much MMORPG mechanics like leveling systems and grinding for equipment, they're a giant time sink, and hopping in and out of short matches in your free time, as it permits, is largely out of the question. This is a criticism I can give a lot of modern shooters, but I'm going to pick on Infinity Ward here because they spearheaded this trend, and when the big successful companies try something new, everyone else copies them. So tisk tisk. As far as the game mechanics, it feels a lot like basically every other Call of Duty game has felt since 2007, with the added function of sliding into cover if you run and hold down the crouch button. Very solid try-and-true movement and gunplay mechanics. Vehicles aren't as refined as they are in other games, but it's a neat addition, especially for those few people out there who have not tried the Battlefield series of games. For quite some time, people would have to go to Call of Duty for close quarters, up-close and personal combat on foot and run-and-gun action, and for large-scale battles and a little bit more realistic movement and gun mechanics, you'd have to switch to Battlefield, until Battlefield 3 introduced the Close Quarters DLC, which brought the Call of Duty map design along for the ride. Call of Duty is now bridging the gap on their end by adding in large-scale warfare with vehicles to their series. I would expect this going forward in all the new Call of Duty games, since a lot of the developers have a habit of not changing things if they find success just once. Now, I'm not a fan of the multiplayer as it is in 2019. Guns don't really feel distinctly different, nor sound distinctly different for that matter. The attitude of the people playing is super cutthroat, similar to what the Xbox 360 players used to behave like back in the days. There's no dedicated servers, so your ping and your opponent's ability to cheat are unpredictable each time, and the general mechanics of movement and shooting are ridiculous when rolled into one. Out of the few big-name shooters getting major playtime on your PC, your Battlefield, your Counter-Strikes, your Rainbow Sixes, only in Call of Duty Modern Warfare is it totally okay for somebody to do a sprint into a sky-high jump and one-shot somebody around the corner in the face while in midair without aiming down the sights, without any kind of recoil or aim steadiness repercussions for flying around that way. Another notable addition to the multiplayer is the ability to cross-play with your console colleagues on Xbox and PlayStation. Two major issues there, however. Number one, this means there are no dedicated servers, which still offers the best experience for smooth gameplay and the ideal neutral conditions for competitive gameplay. And number two, console players have auto-aim assist, and PC players do not. Now, while I'm not saying that console players as a group will always be able to mop the floor with PC players who have to, point the iron sights the old-fashioned way, it's certainly a notable problem for those of us who fancy themselves competitive in nature, because it's just simply not an even playing field. Thankfully, however, crossplay can be turned off. Going back to graphics, again, it's kind of a mixed bag. Within the first few seconds, I was impressed with the fog and lighting effects as you're deployed into a forest late at night during what's supposed to be a covert op, along with improved character models. Now, whether that's a result of increased polygon count or just better use of shadows and textures, I'm not entirely sure. But seconds after deploying, I look to my right and see a huge boulder and some other small rocks, and it looks very, very fake. And I say to myself, okay, so some improvements have been made to an aging engine. This is the problem that plagues pretty much any game and has a yearly release schedule, as opposed to sequels that come out, quote, when they're ready. As annoying as the way it may be, it pays off when the developers are able to take their time and really bring whatever sequel they're working on to the next level, and that just isn't the case here. The addition of ray tracing is nice, but not something I care a whole lot about until I swap graphics cards down the road. As it stands, the GTX 1070 I'm working with does very well in keeping frame rates high, even with all sorts of environmental lighting and shadow effects in the mix. As I got out of single player and into some multiplayer, I became less and less impressed with the graphical quality. I don't really see much of a difference between this or a game like World War III, which is not made by a big budget studio, or Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which came out in 2012, and is on a noticeably aging game engine, much like this one. As for the sound, great voice acting as usual, and the music fits, but it doesn't really stand out to me to the point where I want to go research the original soundtrack on YouTube. Guns have sounded weak to me for years, especially when compared to other FPS titles. I'd even go so far as to say a lot of them sound too similar, rendering the weapons less satisfying to use than they really could be. For replayability, the usual 5 to 7 hours of campaign time is certainly replayable, but I don't really have any motivation to do so, as the story isn't as engaging as previous titles like Black Ops, the original Modern Warfare, or previous World War II-centric entries. Multiplayer is obviously what this game is all about, and has been for years and years. The addition of vehicles, larger maps, and the rumors about an upcoming Battle Royale type mode supporting up to 200 players is intriguing, and maybe that will bring the winds of change to this game and make it irresistible again. But as it stands, Battlefield already does the large-scale combat better, and with the recent emergence of lower-budget but high-quality large-scale FPS titles like Postscriptum, Day of Infamy, Hell Let Loose, Rising Storm, and World War III by up-and-coming developers distributed over Steam, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2019 has an uphill battle ahead of it if it wants to become the reigning champion of that type of multiplayer. Overall, I give this game a thumbs in the middle, maybe leaning up. Call of Duty has a tried and true formula that simply worked for not just years, but more than 2 decades, quite frankly. There's a reason each title is just as successful, if not more so, than the last. It's an enjoyable game, and if you don't mind how similar it is to literally every other Call of Duty game ever made, it's a good experience. As a total package, it has a lot going for it if you look at it in a vacuum. Compared to other games of the same ilk, though, I don't see anything that makes this game stand head and shoulders above the rest, which it should, considering the developer it's coming from, how much money is invested in each title, and the simple reputation the series has. If you like FPS games and you're sick of Battlefield or Counter-Strike, this should definitely be on your Christmas list this holiday season. If you're looking for something revolutionary and new from Activision Blizzard and the Infinity Ward team, you might want to keep moving. Now, with this first episode of my new review series coming to a close, I'd like to thank all of you guys for watching, listening, and please feel free to leave a like and a subscription. It's going to motivate me to do more of these in the future. Until next time, I'm Unreal, and you've just watched a review from An Average Gamer.